September 16th, 1916. Flames tore through the ancient stone corridors of Glamis Castle in the dead of night. Servants ran screaming through halls that had stood for over 5 centuries. Priceless tapestries, centuries-old furniture, irreplaceable family portraits, all threatened by an inferno that seemed determined to devour Scotland's most legendary fortress. In the chaos, a young woman of just 16 years moved with remarkable calm. Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon organized the rescue operation with military precision, directing servants to save the most valuable contents, prioritizing family heirlooms over personal belongings. She didn't panic, didn't freeze, didn't collapse into tears. She simply took command, as if she had been preparing for this moment her entire life. No one watching her that night could have imagined that this girl, born within these very walls, would one day become Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, beloved by millions and one of the most enduring figures in 20th century British history. But then again, Glamis Castle had always produced extraordinary people and harboured extraordinary secrets. This is the story of Glamis Castle, a fortress where Scottish kings were murdered, where witches were burned at the stake, where monsters were allegedly hidden in bricked-up rooms for generations, and where the mother of a queen learned the meaning of duty, courage, and the crushing weight of history that sits on the shoulders of those born into great families. To understand how a medieval castle in the Scottish lowlands became the epicenter of royal births, dark legends, and centuries of intrigue, we must travel back nearly 1,000 years, to a time when Scotland was a savage battlefield and Glamis was soaked in royal blood. We must begin not with architecture or family genealogies, but with murder, power, and the violent birth of a nation. The year 1034 marked a turning point in Scottish history. King Malcolm II, who had ruled Scotland for 29 years, a remarkably long reign for that brutal era, lay dying. But he did not die peacefully in his bed, surrounded by priests murmuring prayers and family members keeping vigil. According to ancient chronicles, Malcolm was mortally wounded in battle near the small settlement of Glamis, in the broad, fertile valley known as Strathmore. This valley, stretching between the Sidlaw Hills to the south and the Grampian Mountains to the north, approximately 20 kilometers inland from the North Sea, had been a site of human habitation for thousands of years. The Picts, Scotland's mysterious pre-Celtic inhabitants, had left their mark here. In fact, a noted intricately carved Pictish stone, known as the Isi stone, was found in a creek bed at the nearby village of Isi. These ancient people, whose language we cannot read and whose culture we can barely reconstruct, considered this valley sacred ground. The wounded king was carried to a royal hunting lodge that stood on the very site where Glamis Castle rises today. Think about that for a moment. Consider the weight of history. The ground beneath Glamis Castle is sanctified, or perhaps cursed, by royal blood spilled nearly a millennium ago. Malcolm II died in that hunting lodge, and with his death, a new chapter of Scottish history began. His grandson, Duncan the Firth, would succeed him through a complicated process that involved eliminating rival claimants to the throne. And Duncan, in turn, would be murdered by Macbeth. Yes, that Macbeth, though the real historical figure bore little resemblance to Shakespeare's tormented tragic villain. The historical Macbeth, who ruled Scotland from 1040 to 1057, was actually a relatively successful king who made a pilgrimage to Rome and ruled competently for 17 years. He wasn't a usurper driven mad by ambition and guilt, but a legitimate claimant to the throne by the succession customs of medieval Scotland. But history cares little for such nuances when faced with the power of great literature. It is this connection to Macbeth that gave Glamis its first brush with immortality. When William Shakespeare wrote his masterpiece between 1603 and 1606, he set crucial scenes at Glamis Castle. Glamis thou art, and Cawdor, and shalt be what thou art promised, the weird sisters tell Macbeth in their prophecy, that sets the entire tragedy in motion. Never mind that the historical Macbeth, who died in 1057, had no actual connection to Glamis Castle. Shakespeare's genius embedded the name Glamis into the consciousness of every educated person in the English-speaking world for the next 4 centuries and beyond. Shakespeare's choice to set his play at Glamis was not arbitrary. By the early 17th century, when he was writing, Glamis Castle had already acquired a reputation as an ancient and significant place. The playwright, working for King James VI of Scotland, who had become James I of England in 1603, knew that Scottish locations would please his royal patron. James was fascinated by witchcraft and the supernatural, and Shakespeare's play, with its witches and prophecies, was partly designed to appeal to the king's interests. Glamis, with its ancient lineage and mysterious atmosphere, was the perfect setting for a tale of ambition, murder, and supernatural doom. But the true story of Glamis Castle, as we know it, begins not with Scottish kings or Shakespeare's imagination, but with a family gift in 1372 that would establish a dynasty lasting to the present day. In 1372, King Robert II of Scotland made a decision that would shape the next 6.5 centuries of Scottish history. He granted the lands and castle of Glamis to Sir John Lyon, who held the title of Thane of Glamis. This was no ordinary gift. Sir John Lyon had married the king's daughter, Princess Jean, making him royal family by marriage. The grant of Glamis was a wedding present fit for a king's son-in-law, a fortress and vast estates in one of Scotland's most fertile regions. To understand the significance of this gift, we need to understand something about medieval Scotland's political structure. Scotland was a patchwork of competing powers. The king theoretically ruled the entire country, but his actual control was limited. Great nobles commanded private armies and ruled their territories with near absolute authority. The clans of the Highlands followed their chiefs, not the king in Edinburgh, and foreign powers, particularly England, constantly meddled in Scottish affairs, supporting one faction against another in an endless game of divide and conquer. In this context, royal patronage was crucial. A gift of land from the king was not just wealth, it was legitimacy. It announced to every other noble in Scotland that Sir John Lyon was under royal protection and enjoyed royal favour. Any attack on Lyon would be an attack on the king himself. This was the real value of the Glamis grant, beyond the agricultural productivity of the land or the military strength of the castle. Sir John Lyon was no mere courtier. He was a warrior and administrator who had proven his worth to the crown. The historical record is frustratingly sparse about his early life. Medieval record-keeping was haphazard at best, but we know he must have distinguished himself in service to King Robert II. Perhaps he had fought in the endless border wars with England. Perhaps he had helped suppress rebellious nobles. Perhaps he had served as an administrator, collecting taxes and managing royal estates. Whatever his services, they were significant enough that the king gave him both his daughter and one of Scotland's finest castles. The gift of Glamis elevated Sir John Lyon to the ranks of Scotland's most powerful nobles, and unlike so many noble families who rose and fell with the changing tides of fortune, wiped out in battles, executed for treason, bankrupted by debts, or simply dying out through failure of male heirs, the Lyons held on to Glamis through revolution, reformation, civil war, and the union of the Scottish and English crowns. From 1372 to the present day, an unbroken line of over 650 years, Glamis has remained in the same family. Very few castles in Britain or anywhere in Europe can claim such continuity. Windsor Castle has been a royal residence for nearly 1,000 years, but it has passed through multiple royal dynasties. Glamis has remained with the descendants of one man for over 6 centuries. This continuity is remarkable, not just for its duration, but for what it represents. Each generation of the Lyon family had to navigate the treacherous waters of Scottish politics to maintain their position. They had to know when to support the king and when to remain neutral. They had to manage their estates effectively to generate the wealth needed to maintain their status. They had to produce male heirs to inherit the title and estates, and they had to avoid the countless disasters that could destroy a noble family: bankruptcy, treason, plague, war, or simple bad luck. But owning a castle and building a castle are two different things. The structure that Sir John Lyon acquired in 1372 was likely a fortified manor house or keep, suitable for defence but hardly the magnificent palace that would emerge in later centuries. It was Sir John's descendants who would transform Glamis from a defensive fortress into an architectural masterpiece that would eventually grace Scottish banknotes and become recognised around the world. By the early 15th century, the Lyons had rebuilt Glamis as an L-plan tower house, a distinctly Scottish architectural form that combined defensive strength with residential comfort. The L-plan design, with its two wings meeting at right angles, provided better defense than a simple rectangular keep. Attackers couldn't easily surround it, and defenders could fire upon enemies from multiple angles. The re-entrant angle, the internal corner where the two wings met, was particularly defensible, as it could be covered by fire from windows in both wings. But the L-plan also created more interior space and allowed for larger windows, making the castle more livable. Medieval fortresses were notoriously uncomfortable. Small windows kept out light and air, but also arrows and siege weapons. Thick stone walls provided protection, but also made rooms cold and damp. The constant tension between security and comfort defined castle architecture for centuries. The L-plan represented a shift toward comfort, suggesting that Scotland was becoming more peaceful and that nobles could afford to prioritize quality of life over pure military strength. The title Lord Glamis was created in 1445 for Sir Patrick Lyon, grandson of the original Sir John. This was a significant elevation in status. The Lyons were no longer merely wealthy landowners, they were peers of the realm, with a seat in the Scottish Parliament and increasing influence at court. Patrick Lyon, the first Lord Glamis, died in 1459, having consolidated the family's position among Scotland's nobility. His tomb, along with those of his successors, would eventually rest in the family chapel at Glamis, creating a physical link between the living Lyons and their ancestors, stretching back through the centuries. The 15th century was a turbulent time in Scottish history. The country was racked by factional conflicts as various noble families competed for control of the young kings who succeeded to the throne as minors. The Douglases, the Stuarts, the Hamiltons, and other great families formed shifting alliances and engaged in what amounted to low-level civil war. The Lyons navigated these treacherous waters with skill, aligning themselves with the winning side often enough to preserve their position, without becoming so closely identified with any faction that they would be destroyed when power shifted. But it was under John Lyon, 6th Lord Glamis, that the family encountered one of the darkest chapters in Scottish history, a chapter that would give birth to Glamis Castle's most enduring legends of ghosts, curses, and evil. This chapter involves not just political intrigue, but the darkest accusations medieval society could bring against a person: treason, murder, and witchcraft. John Lyon, 6th Lord Glamis, made what seemed like an advantageous marriage when he wed Janet Douglas, daughter of the Master of Angus at some point in the early 16th century. The exact date of their marriage is lost to history, but we know it took place during the minority of King James V, who was born in 1512 and began his personal rule only in 1528 at the age of 16. The Douglas family was one of the most powerful in Scotland, with extensive lands, a private army that could field thousands of men, and a history of involvement in the highest levels of Scottish politics. The Douglases had been Earls of Angus for generations, and they controlled much of southeastern Scotland. But in the early 16th century, the young King James V was engaged in a bitter, personal feud with the Douglases. During James's minority, his stepfather, Archibald Douglas, 6th Earl of Angus, had effectively held the young king prisoner, controlling access to him and ruling Scotland in his name. James was kept virtually under house arrest, unable to make his own decisions or even choose his own companions. The psychological impact of this captivity on the young king cannot be overstated. When James finally managed to escape Douglas control in 1528, at the age of 16, he was determined not just to break the Douglases' power, but to destroy them utterly. In December 1528, Janet Douglas, Lady Glamis, was accused of treason. The charge was that she had brought supporters of the Earl of Angus to Edinburgh, supporters who were considered enemies of the crown. This was a serious charge, but in the context of the times, not necessarily a death sentence. Many nobles had supported the Douglases during the king's minority, and James couldn't execute them all without destroying the Scottish nobility. But this was only the beginning of Janet Douglas's ordeal. On September 17, 1528, Lord Glamis died. The exact cause of his death is unknown. He may have died of natural causes, or perhaps in an accident. But almost immediately, Lady Glamis was accused of poisoning her husband. There was no evidence, of course, no witnesses to the alleged poisoning, no poison found, no confession from alleged accomplices. The accusation was purely political, designed to destroy the Douglas family's allies and seize their property. Janet Douglas, as a Douglas herself, and the widow of a Douglas ally, was a perfect target. By accusing her of murder, King James could seize the Glamis estates and send a message to every other Douglas supporter. This is what happens to those who opposed me. But King James V wanted to ensure Lady Glamis's destruction beyond any possibility of escape or pardon. The ultimate charge was brought against her, witchcraft. In the 16th century, an accusation of witchcraft was virtually a death sentence. The charge of witchcraft carried with it implications of heresy, of alliance with the devil himself. A person convicted of witchcraft couldn't just be executed. They had to be executed in a way that reflected the magnitude of their crime. They had to be burned alive. The trial of Lady Glamis was a mockery of justice. Witnesses were produced who claimed to have seen her consorting with the devil, preparing poisons, casting spells. These witnesses were almost certainly coerced or bribed, or were simply repeating rumors that had been deliberately spread by the king's agents. Janet Douglas protested her innocence throughout the trial, but it made no difference. The verdict was predetermined. On July 17, 1537, Lady Glamis was burned at the stake at Edinburgh Castle, in front of jeering crowds who had been told she was a witch and a murderess. Contemporary accounts describe her maintaining her dignity and her protestations of innocence even as the flames rose around her. She died slowly. Burning at the stake was not a quick death, and in excruciating agony. King James V watched the execution, ensuring that his vengeance was complete. Immediately afterward, he seized Glamis Castle and its estates, and lived there for some time, enjoying the fruits of his judicial murder. Janet Douglas's son and heir was also arrested and imprisoned, though he was too young to be executed. The entire family was destroyed, their property confiscated, their name dragged through the mud. It was one of the most flagrant abuses of royal power in Scottish history, and it left a permanent mark on Glamis Castle, not just in the historical record, but in the realm of legend. To this day, the castle is said to be haunted by the White Lady, believed to be the ghost of Janet Douglas. According to castle guides, a seat in the castle's small chapel, which holds only 46 people, is always reserved for the White Lady. The chapel is still used for family functions, including baptisms, weddings, and memorial services, but no one is permitted to sit in that particular seat. Servants and visitors have reported seeing a glowing figure in white moving through the corridors near the chapel, particularly in the early morning hours or late at night. Others speak of a feeling of overwhelming sadness in certain rooms, particularly those associated with Lady Glamis's imprisonment, before her final journey to Edinburgh and execution. The White Lady is described as appearing sorrowful but not menacing. She doesn't threaten or frighten people, but rather seems to be searching for something or someone. Some believe she is looking for her son, trying to protect him even in death. Others believe she is simply bound to the place where she was happy before her life was destroyed by a vindictive king. Whatever the truth, the legend of the White Lady has become an integral part of Glamis Castle's identity. Every tourist who visits the castle hears her story, and many claim to have felt her presence. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, the story of Lady Glamis represents something very real about Glamis Castle and about medieval Scottish history more broadly: the vulnerability of even the most powerful nobles to royal displeasure in an age of absolute monarchy. Glamis Castle had been seized by the king through judicial murder. The Lyons had been dispossessed of their ancestral home through false charges and political vengeance. Their family member had been burned alive on trumped-up charges of witchcraft and murder. It was a trauma that would reverberate through the family's consciousness for generations. But they would get the castle back. The wheel of fortune never stops turning, and King James V's vengeance would not stand forever. In 1543, 6 years after Lady Glamis's execution and 5 years after King James V's death, Glamis Castle was restored to John Lyon, 7th Lord Glamis, son of the murdered Lady Janet. The restoration was made possible by the chaos following James V's death. The king had died in 1542, shortly after the disastrous Scottish defeat at the Battle of Solway Moss, leaving an infant daughter, Mary, as his heir. Mary, Queen of Scots, was only 6 days old when her father died. Scotland was plunged into turmoil, with competing factions fighting for control of the regency. In this chaos, many of James V's more vindictive acts were reversed. Political prisoners were released. Confiscated estates were returned to their original owners. The Lyons, who had powerful allies despite their persecution, successfully petitioned for the return of Glamis. It was a bittersweet homecoming. John Lyon, 7th Lord Glamis, was returning to the castle where his mother had lived, loved and raised her children before being dragged away to a horrific death. The castle bore the scars of royal occupation. But more importantly, the Lyons now understood at a visceral level that their survival depended not just on their wealth and military power, but on their ability to navigate the treacherous waters of Scottish court politics. They had learned a brutal lesson about the limits of noble autonomy and the danger of royal disfavour. The family's fortunes truly revived under Patrick Lyon, 9th Lord Glamis, who was created Earl of Kinghorn in 1606. This elevation to an earldom, one of the highest ranks in the Scottish nobility, reflected both the family's recovered wealth and their improved political position. This was during the reign of James VI of Scotland, who had become James I of England in 1603, uniting the Scottish and English crowns in his person. James VI was a very different king from his great-grandfather James V. Where James V had been vindictive and paranoid, James VI was politically astute and relatively tolerant. He understood that stable governance required the cooperation of the nobility, not their terrorization. Patrick Lyon, now Earl of Kinghorn, was a man of ambition and vision. He looked at the medieval castle he had inherited, still essentially the L-plan tower house built in the 15th century, and saw an opportunity to create something magnificent, something that would announce to Scotland and to the world that the Lyons were not just survivors of past persecution, but triumphant and prosperous nobles looking towards the future. Beginning in 1606, Earl Patrick undertook massive reconstruction of Glamis Castle. An inscription on the central tower commemorates this work, built by Patrick, Lord Glamis, and D. Anna Murray. Anna Murray was his wife, and the inscription acknowledges her role in the transformation of Glamis, a rare recognition of a woman's contribution in that era, when women's work was usually invisible in the historical record. The architectural style that emerged was distinctly Scottish, but with continental influences filtered through Scottish traditions. For centuries, tradition held that the famous English architect Inigo Jones, who introduced classical Renaissance architecture to England, had redesigned Glamis Castle. It would have been a prestigious attribution. Jones was the architect of the Queen's House at Greenwich and the Banqueting House at Whitehall, masterpieces of English Renaissance architecture that broke with medieval traditions and embraced the clarity and proportion of Italian classicism. However, modern scholars and historic Scotland now consider William Shaw, the King's master mason, a much more likely candidate for the architectural design of Glamis. The architecture of Glamis, with its conical turrets, corbelled parapets, vertical emphasis, and distinctly unclassical proportions, is thoroughly Scottish in character, owing more to French chateau design than to Italian Renaissance classicism. The Scottish baronial style, as it would later be called, looked to France rather than Italy for inspiration. This made sense historically. Scotland and France had maintained the Old Alliance for centuries, a political and military partnership directed against their common enemy, England. French culture had tremendous prestige in Scotland. Wealthy Scots studied at French universities, drank French wine, and imitated French fashions. When Scottish architects wanted to create impressive buildings, they naturally looked to the chateaux of the Loire Valley and other regions of France for inspiration. The result of Patrick Lyon's reconstruction was the castle we see today, or at least its essential form. Rising from the fertile plains of Strathmore like a fairy tale illustration, Glamis Castle combines medieval strength with Renaissance elegance. The central tower soars skyward, reaching a height that dominates the landscape for miles around. Flanking this central tower are smaller turrets topped with conical roofs that give the castle its distinctive silhouette. The walls, built of local grey stone that shifts colour depending on the light and weather, are massively thick, in some places over 1 metre thick, remnants of the castle's defensive origins. But now those walls are pierced by large windows, flooding the interior with light, and the roofline is a forest of chimneys, turrets, and decorative battlements that serve no military purpose but create a skyline of breathtaking complexity and beauty. The approach to the castle features 2 impressive towers, each measuring 7 meters in diameter and about 4 meters high. These towers, topped with modern parapets that were added in later centuries, frame the entrance and create a sense of grandeur even before one enters the castle itself. The walls of these towers are a full metre thick enough to withstand artillery bombardment, though by the 17th century, the age of the castle as a military stronghold was ending. Castles were becoming palaces, statements of prestige and refinement rather than fortresses of war. Visitors approaching Glamis in the 17th century would have been awed by what they saw. The castle dominated the landscape, visible for miles across the flat plains of Strathmore. As they drew closer, the complexity of the architecture would become apparent: the interlocking towers, the steep pitched roofs, the corbelled turrets projecting from the walls. This was architecture designed to impress, to announce the wealth and sophistication of its owners. And it succeeded brilliantly. Glamis became recognised as one of Scotland's finest castles, a worthy rival to any chateau in France or palace in England. The 17th century was a time of turmoil throughout Britain. The conflict between King Charles I and Parliament erupted into civil war in 1642. This wasn't just an English conflict. Scotland was deeply involved, and the wars devastated the country. Armies marched back and forth across the lowlands, requisitioning supplies, occupying castles, and leaving destruction in their wake. Villages were burned, crops were seized, livestock was slaughtered to feed soldiers. The civilian population suffered terribly. Scotland's involvement in the civil wars was complicated by religious conflict. The Presbyterian Church, established in Scotland in the 16th century, was suspicious of Charles III's religious policies, which seemed to be moving the Church of England back toward Catholicism. When civil war broke out in England, the Scots initially sided with Parliament against the king, but the execution of Charles I in 1649 horrified many Scots, who saw it as both a moral outrage and a violation of the ancient principle that kings ruled by divine right. Scotland proclaimed Charles's son as Charles II, even though England had abolished the monarchy and established the Commonwealth under Oliver Cromwell. This decision led to Cromwell's invasion of Scotland in 1650. English armies occupied the country, and English soldiers were garrisoned in castles throughout the Scottish lowlands. During the Commonwealth period, the brief Republican government under Oliver Cromwell that lasted from 1649 until 1660, English soldiers were garrisoned at Glamis Castle. For the Lyon family, this was a humiliation. Their castle, symbol of their power and prestige, was occupied by enemy troops. The soldiers cared nothing for the castle's history or beauty. They used the grand rooms as barracks, stabled their horses in the courtyards, and helped themselves to whatever provisions they wanted from the estate. Fine furniture was broken up for firewood. Tapestries were torn down. The carefully maintained gardens were trampled and neglected. When Patrick Lyon, 3rd Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn, finally returned to Glamis in 1670 after the restoration of the monarchy under Charles II, he found the castle in a deplorable state. Years of military occupation had left it essentially uninhabitable. Rooms were damaged, furnishings were destroyed or stolen, and years of neglect had allowed the weather to worsen the decay. Roofs leaked, allowing water to damage ceilings and walls. Windows were broken. The gardens were overgrown. The 3rd Earl set about an ambitious program of restoration that lasted until 1689, 19 years of continuous work to repair the damage and, more importantly, to reimagine what Glamis could be. This was not merely repair work, it was a reimagining of Glamis Castle's grounds and gardens. Inspired by the great baroque gardens then fashionable on the continent, particularly in France under Louis XIV, the Earl created elaborate formal gardens around the castle. These featured geometric parterres, formal garden beds arranged in intricate patterns, ornamental fountains that required complex hydraulic systems to operate, topiary shaped into geometric forms and fantastical shapes, and long, tree-lined avenues that created dramatic approaches to the castle. The great sundial that still stands on the front lawn dates from this period, an elaborate sculptural composition featuring lions and topped with intricate metalwork showing the signs of the zodiac and various heraldic devices. This sundial was both functional and symbolic. Functionally, it told time with reasonable accuracy in an age when mechanical clocks were still rare and expensive. Symbolically, it announced the Earl's learning and sophistication. Sundials required mathematical knowledge to design and build correctly. The inclusion of zodiacal symbols also reflected the period's interest in astrology, which was still considered a legitimate field of study in the late 17th century. The Baroque garden at Glamis was a statement of power and culture. It announced that the Earls of Strathmore and Kinghorn were not provincial Scottish nobles, but sophisticated European aristocrats who understood the latest continental fashions in art and landscaping. Visitors approaching the castle would walk through these gardens, experiencing a carefully choreographed sequence of spaces designed to awe and impress long before they entered the castle itself. This was theatre, a performance of power and refinement enacted in plants, water, and stone. In 1767, a marriage took place that would transform the fortunes of Glamis Castle and link the Lyon family permanently with one of England's great industrial fortunes. John Lyon, 9th Earl of Strathmore, and Kinghorn married Mary Eleanor Bowes, heiress to a vast coal mining fortune centred in County Durham in northern England. This marriage was a turning point in the family's history, bringing new wealth at a crucial moment. The Bowes family had made their fortune from the coal seams that lay beneath their estates in County Durham. The 18th century saw an explosion in demand for coal as Britain industrialized. Coal powered the steam engines that drove textile mills, iron foundries, and eventually locomotives and ships. It heated homes and workshops. It fired the furnaces that smelted iron and forged steel. The Industrial Revolution literally ran on coal, and those who controlled coal mines could amass enormous fortunes. The Bowes coal mines were among the most productive in England. Deep shafts penetrated hundreds of feet underground, where miners worked in dangerous conditions, extracting the black rock that powered the nation. The Bowes family had invested heavily in the infrastructure needed to move coal from mine to market: canals, roads, and eventually railways. They owned not just the mines, but the transportation networks that made the mines profitable. This vertical integration allowed them to control costs and maximize profits. Mary Eleanor Bowes brought this enormous wealth into the Lyon family. The exact value of her fortune is difficult to calculate in modern terms, but contemporary estimates suggest she was one of the wealthiest heiresses in Britain. Her annual income from the coal mines and other investments was larger than the income of many aristocratic families from all their estates combined. The hyphenated name Bowes Lyon dates from this marriage. By combining the two family names, the Lyons acknowledged the importance of the Bowes fortune to their continued prosperity. In effect, Mary Eleanor Bowes was not just marrying into the Lyon family, she was creating a new family that combined the ancient lineage and social prestige of the Scottish Lyons with the modern industrial wealth of the English Bowes. This combination of old blood and new money was typical of the period, as aristocratic families sought to maintain their lifestyle in the face of rising costs and declining agricultural incomes. John Lyon, now with access to his wife's vast fortune, set about improving the grounds of Glamis Castle in the fashionable Picturesque style of the 1770s. The Picturesque movement was a reaction against the rigid formality of baroque gardens. Instead of straight lines and geometric shapes, picturesque landscapes featured winding paths, irregular plantings, artificial ruins, and careful compositions that resembled landscape paintings by artists like Claude Lorrain and Nicolas Poussin. The goal was to make the landscape look natural and romantic, even though it was actually as carefully designed and managed as any formal garden. The Earl created an arboretum, a collection of trees from around the world, overlooking Glamis Burn, one of two streams running through the estate. This arboretum still exists today and includes rare species and specimens several hundred years old. Walking through it is like taking a botanical tour of the world. American giant sequoias tower next to Japanese maples, exotic conifers from Chile grow alongside native Scottish oaks, cedars from Lebanon spread their dramatic horizontal branches, and monkey puzzle trees from the Andes display their bizarre prehistoric appearance. The Arboretum represented the global reach of the British Empire at its height. Plants gathered from every corner of the world, brought to Scotland at enormous expense and effort, and cultivated on the grounds of an ancient castle. Each tree represented an expedition, a botanical discovery, a triumph of empire and science. The Arboretum was both a garden and a museum, a living collection that demonstrated the Earl's wealth, learning, and connection to the wider world of Enlightenment science and exploration. The transformation of the grounds also included improvements to the agricultural operations of the estate. The Glamis estate covers more than 57 square kilometres, over 14,000 acres, making it one of the largest estates in Scotland. This land produced rental income from tenant farmers, but it also included home farms operated directly by the Earl's employees. The application of scientific agricultural methods developed during the agricultural revolution of the 18th century dramatically increased the productivity of these farms. New crops like turnips and potatoes were introduced. crop rotation systems replaced medieval strip farming. Livestock breeding became more systematic, producing larger and healthier animals. These improvements increased the estate's income and demonstrated the Earl's commitment to progressive management. In the early 19th century, disaster struck again. A fire broke out in the southwest wing of the castle, causing extensive damage. The exact date of this fire is not precisely recorded in surviving documents, but it occurred sometime in the first 2 decades of the 1800s. Fires were an ever-present danger in buildings lit by candles and oil lamps and heated by massive fireplaces burning coal and wood. Once started, fires could spread rapidly through wooden floors and paneling, and with no modern firefighting equipment, no fire trucks, no pressurized water systems, no chemical extinguishers, stopping them was nearly impossible. The best that could usually be done was to evacuate people and save whatever valuable objects could be carried out before the flames consumed everything. The southwest wing had to be completely rebuilt after the fire. This reconstruction work, completed by the 1820s, was carried out in a style sympathetic to the earlier architecture, but incorporating improvements in comfort and convenience that would have been impossible or prohibitively expensive in earlier centuries. Better ventilation systems removed smoke and odors. More efficient heating systems using advanced fireplace designs and eventually cast-iron radiators made rooms warmer and more comfortable. Improved plumbing brought running water to more parts of the castle, though full modern plumbing with bathrooms as we know them wouldn't arrive until later in the century. The rebuilding also provided an opportunity to create larger, more comfortable rooms with higher ceilings and better natural light. Windows were enlarged, taking advantage of improvements in glass manufacturing that made large panes cheaper and more readily available. The thick medieval walls that provided excellent defense were now a liability, as they made rooms dark and cold, but they couldn't be torn down without endangering the structural integrity of the entire castle. Instead, the architects worked within the constraints, creating rooms that felt spacious and light, despite the limitations imposed by walls built for defense rather than comfort. In the 1920s, long after the fire damage had been repaired, a massive fireplace was removed from Gibbside, the Bowes family estate near Gateshead in northern England, and installed in Glamis Castle's billiard room. This fireplace is a masterpiece of carved stone, displaying the coat of arms of the Blakiston family. The Blakiston heiress Elizabeth had married Sir William Bowes, linking 2 great northern English families. The fireplace's installation at Glamis in the 1920s was another symbol of the deep connections between the Scottish Lions and the English Bowes families, connections that went back more than 150 years to the marriage of Mary Eleanor Bowes and the 9th Earl. The dining room and several other principal interiors date from extensive renovations in the 18th and 19th centuries. These rooms reflect the changing tastes of successive generations of the family. Georgian elegance gives way to Victorian opulence. Delicate Rococo plasterwork with its characteristic asymmetry and lightness contrasts with heavy Victorian furniture in dark woods with elaborate carving. Silk wall coverings from China hang next to Scottish landscapes in massive gilded frames. The castle became a palimpsest of styles, each generation leaving its mark while respecting what had come before. This layering of styles is typical of great houses that have been continuously occupied by the same family. Each generation adds to the accumulation without erasing the past. The Victorian era saw the peak of the British aristocracy's wealth and power. The Industrial Revolution had made Britain the workshop of the world, and the British Empire covered a quarter of the globe. The Bowes-Lyon family, with their combination of ancient Scottish lineage and modern industrial wealth, were perfectly positioned to participate in this golden age. They maintained a London house for the social season, when aristocrats gathered in the capital for balls, dinners, theatre, and the presentation of debutantes to the Queen. They travelled extensively on the continent, visiting Paris, Rome, and the German spa towns. And they continually improved Glamis Castle, installing the latest technologies and decorating in the most fashionable styles. By the late 19th century, Glamis had evolved from a medieval fortress into a Victorian palace, comfortable and luxurious, but still recognizably the same building that Patrick Lyon had rebuilt in the early 17th century. The layers of history were visible everywhere. Medieval walls supported Renaissance turrets topped with Victorian chimneys. Ancient stone staircases led to rooms decorated in the latest fashion. It was a building that embodied the continuity and adaptation that had allowed the Bowes-Lyon family to survive and prosper for over 5 centuries. But let us return to the legends, for they are as much a part of Glamis Castle's identity as its architecture or its role in Scottish history. If Lady Glamis is the castle's most famous ghost, she is far from its only supernatural inhabitant. Glamis has been called the most haunted castle in Britain, and the stories told about it range from the plausible to the fantastical, from the tragic to the terrifying. The most notorious legend is that of the monster of Glamis. According to this story, a hideously deformed child was born to the Bowes-Lyon family. Accounts vary as to when this supposedly occurred, but most place it in the 19th century, possibly in the 1820s or 1830s. The child, so the story goes, was so severely deformed that the family decided to hide him away rather than face the shame and scandal of having produced such a creature. Some versions describe the monster as being covered in hair, with an egg-shaped body and no neck, tiny arms and legs, and grotesque features that barely resembled a human face. The child was kept hidden in a secret suite of rooms in the castle, cared for by trusted servants sworn to secrecy. The family told the world that the baby had died at birth or shortly after, but in reality, the monster lived on, hidden away from the world. Only the Earl's heir, and perhaps a lawyer or estate manager knew the truth. Each Earl, upon inheriting the title, was told the family secret on his 21st birthday, the secret of the monster hidden in the walls. When the monster finally died, after living for decades, far longer than anyone expected or wanted, the suite of rooms was bricked up, sealing away the secret forever. But the story didn't die. Servants whispered about strange sounds heard in the night, about a hidden room that appeared on no floor plans, about a family curse that produced a monster in every generation or every century. The legend gained currency from accounts by Virginia Gabriel, a singer and composer who stayed at Glamis in 1870. She claimed to have heard disturbing sounds in the night, not the normal creaks and groans of an old building, but something more deliberate and unsettling. She was told oblique hints about a family secret, something terrible that couldn't be discussed openly. Later, other guests reported similar experiences. Some claimed to have seen a figure in the shadows that didn't seem quite human. Others spoke of a sense of malevolent presence in certain parts of the castle. One famous story tells of a house party at which the guests, curious about the legend and frustrated by the family's refusal to discuss it, hung towels from every window they could access in an attempt to map the castle's occupied rooms. They reasoned that if they could see which windows had no towels when viewing the castle from outside, they could identify the location of the secret suite. When they looked at the castle from the gardens, several windows had no towels, suggesting hidden rooms that guests could not enter. Of course, the more prosaic explanation is that servants, under orders from the family, removed the towels from certain windows to preserve the mystery and keep guests from identifying purely functional spaces like storage rooms or servants' quarters. An alternative version of the legend suggests that a vampire child is born to the family in every generation and is walled up in the secret room. This variation adds a supernatural element to what might otherwise be a tragic story of a severely disabled child hidden away in an era when such conditions were considered shameful. The vampire version reflects Victorian-era fascination with Gothic horror and the supernatural, particularly after the publication of Bram Stoker's Dracula in 1897. Modern scholars believe that if there is any truth to the monster of Glamis legend, it may be inspired by the historical story of the Ogilvies. According to this account, members of the Ogilvy family, a rival clan, sought refuge at Glamis during a clan war in the 16th or 17th century. The Earl of Strathmore, who had his own grievances against the Ogilvies, granted them sanctuary and directed them to a secure room in the castle where they would be safe from their enemies. But once the Ogilvies were inside, the Earl locked the door from the outside and left them to starve to death. When the room was finally opened, weeks or months later, the scene was horrific. The Ogilvies had turned to cannibalism in their desperation, trying to stave off starvation by consuming the bodies of those who died first. Some versions claim that the room was never properly cleaned afterward, that the blood and horror were simply sealed away behind new walls. Other versions claim that the screams of the dying Ogilvies can still be heard echoing through the castle on certain nights, particularly during storms when the wind howls around the turrets. This story has the ring of historical plausibility. Clan feuds in medieval and early modern Scotland were brutal affairs, and acts of treachery were not uncommon. Locking enemies in a room and leaving them to starve would have been seen as a form of justice by some and as dishonorable treachery by others. The story may have been embellished and exaggerated over the centuries, but it likely has some basis in a real event. Then there is the legend of Earl Beardy, a story that combines elements of the Faust legend with Scottish clan history and the Presbyterian obsession with Sabbath-keeping. Earl Beardy has been identified with either Alexander Lyon, 2nd Lord Glamis, who died in 1486, or Alexander Lindsay, 4th Earl of Crawford, who died in 1453. The core of the story is always the same. Earl Beardy was playing cards on the Sabbath, a serious sin in Presbyterian Scotland where Sunday was reserved for worship and rest. When his hosts or servants urged him to stop out of concern for his soul, he flew into a rage and declared he would play cards until doomsday, or with the devil himself if no mortal opponent would face him. A mysterious stranger then appeared at the castle and offered to join the card game. The stranger was elegantly dressed, spoke in a cultured manner, but had something unsettling about him. Cold eyes, perhaps, or an unnatural stillness. The game continued through the night, with increasingly high stakes. Earl Beardy bet gold, then land, then family heirlooms, each time losing to the stranger and growing more desperate. As dawn approached, it became clear that the stranger was the devil, and that Earl Beardy had lost not just his wealth, but his soul. According to the legend, Earl Beardy is condemned to play cards with the devil until Judgment Day in a hidden room of the castle. On stormy nights, particularly nights of the Sabbath, guests and servants have reported hearing the sound of dice rolling, curses shouted in archaic Scots, and the stamp of boots on wooden floors coming from empty rooms. Some claim to have seen flickering candlelight under the door of rooms that should be dark and unoccupied. Others report a sulphurous smell, like brimstone, wafting through certain corridors. Are these stories true? Almost certainly not in their supernatural details. But they reflect something real about Glamis Castle, its age, its complex architecture with hidden staircases and forgotten rooms, and its central role in Scottish history for over 6 centuries. Every old castle accumulates legends, but Glamis has more than most because it has been continuously occupied by the same family for so long. Secrets can accumulate, stories can be embroidered, and the boundary between history and legend can become blurred. The legends also serve a cultural function. They make the castle more interesting to visitors, more memorable, more distinct from other historic houses. In an age of tourism, when hundreds of castles compete for visitors' attention and entrance fees, having good ghost stories is valuable. But more than that, the legends give the castle a kind of depth and resonance. They suggest that the visible history, the dates and architectural styles and famous residents, is only part of the story, that there are deeper mysteries hidden in the walls. On August 4, 1900, Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was born at Glamis Castle, the youngest daughter of Claude Bowes-Lyon, 14th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn, and his wife, Cecilia, née Cavendish-Bentinck. She was the 9th of 10 children in a large and close-knit family. No one watching the baby that day could have imagined she would one day be Queen of the United Kingdom and Empress of India, that her daughter would reign for 70 years, or that she herself would become one of the most beloved figures in 20th century British history. Lady Elizabeth spent much of her childhood at Glamis. The castle was her playground, her schoolroom, and her refuge. She knew every corridor, every hidden staircase, every room. She played in the gardens designed by her ancestors, walked in the arboretum with its trees from around the world, and sat in the chapel where the White Lady's seat remained forever empty. She learned the family stories and legends, hearing about Lady Glamis burned at the stake, Earl Beardy playing cards with the devil, and the monster hidden in the walls. These stories, whether she believed them or not, became part of her imaginative landscape. Glamis shaped Lady Elizabeth's character in ways that would become evident decades later. The castle instilled in her a sense of history and continuity, a feeling of being part of something larger than herself. She understood that she was not just Claude Bowes-Lyon's daughter, but the latest in a long line stretching back to Sir John Lyon in 1372. This sense of historical continuity would serve her well when she married into the royal family and had to represent centuries of British history. The castle also taught her about responsibility. Running a great house like Glamis required constant attention. There were dozens of servants to manage, tenant farmers to oversee, maintenance issues to address, social obligations to fulfill. Even as a child, Lady Elizabeth would have seen her parents dealing with these responsibilities. She learned that privilege came with duties, that owning a place like Glamis meant being its steward, caring for it and passing it on improved to the next generation. When the First World War broke out in August 1914, Glamis Castle was transformed into a military hospital for wounded soldiers. This was common among great houses. Their large rooms, extensive facilities, and staffs made them suitable for conversion to hospitals. Lady Elizabeth, though only 14 years old when the war began, threw herself into helping care for the wounded. She assisted nurses in changing dressings, wrote letters for soldiers who couldn't write themselves, played cards and chess with recovering men, read to those who were bedridden, and brought a touch of warmth and humanity to men who had experienced the horrors of the Western Front. This experience, caring for wounded soldiers at Glamis, taught Lady Elizabeth lessons about duty, compassion, and the responsibilities of privilege that she would carry throughout her life. She saw men from all walks of life, from factory workers to farmers, officers, and privates alike. She saw terrible wounds, both physical and psychological. She saw men die, and she saw men recover through a combination of medical care and simple human kindness. She learned that nobility was not about titles and wealth, but about character and courage. The soldiers she cared for, many of them from working-class backgrounds with little education, displayed dignity and fortitude that impressed her deeply. The war also brought home to her the fragility of the world she had grown up in. Young men from the estate went off to fight and didn't come back. The certainties of Edwardian Britain, the assumption that progress was inevitable, that the social order was stable, that Britain's power and prosperity would continue indefinitely, were shattered by 4 years of mechanized slaughter. By the time the armistice was signed in November 1918, over 700,000 British soldiers were dead, and more than 1 million were wounded. Every family in Britain had been touched by loss. Then came the fire of September 16, 1916, We began this story with that fire, but it's worth returning to it now that we know more about Lady Elizabeth and her character. As flames tore through the ancient castle in the middle of the night, Lady Elizabeth organized the rescue operation with remarkable composure. She didn't panic. She didn't freeze. She didn't collapse into tears. She simply took command, as if she had been preparing for this moment her entire life. She directed servants in saving the most valuable and irreplaceable items, family portraits dating back centuries, showing ancestors in the clothing of their times, their faces stern or smiling across the gulf of years. Historical documents, including the original grant of Glamis from King Robert II in 1372. Family heirlooms that couldn't be replaced at any price. She prioritized these items over her own possessions, showing a maturity far beyond her 16 years. The castle was saved, though with significant damage that would take months to repair, and much of the credit belonged to Lady Elizabeth's leadership during the crisis. On April 26, 1923, Lady Elizabeth married Prince Albert, Duke of York, second son of King George V, at Westminster Abbey in London. It was a love match, unusual for royal marriages at the time, which were typically arranged for political or dynastic reasons. The Duke, who would later become King George VI, had proposed to Elizabeth 3 times before she finally accepted. She had been reluctant to marry into the royal family, knowing it would mean giving up much of her privacy and freedom. Royal life was highly constrained, with every action subject to protocol and public scrutiny. But Albert's persistent devotion finally won her over. He was a sincere, honest man who genuinely loved her and promised her as much freedom and normalcy as royal life would allow. As Duchess of York, Elizabeth lived in London and travelled the world representing the British monarchy. But she never forgot Glamis. She returned regularly, particularly during the summer months, bringing her own daughters, the future Queen Elizabeth II, born in 1926, and Princess Margaret, born in 1930. Princess Margaret's birth at Glamis Castle on August 21, 1930, created a sensation in the British press. She was the first royal baby born in Scotland in over 300 years. The last had been Charles III, born at Dunfermline Palace in 1600. The birth of a princess in the ancient castle, with all its legends of ghosts and monsters, captured the public imagination. Newspapers ran stories about Glamis's history, its architecture, and its supernatural reputation. The romantic idea of a princess born in a haunted castle appealed to readers still suffering through the economic depression that followed the 1929 stock market crash. When King George V died in January 1936, Albert's older brother became King Edward VIII. But Edward's determination to marry the American divorcee Wallis Simpson created a constitutional crisis. The Church of England, of which the king was supreme governor, did not allow divorced people whose former spouses were still alive to remarry in church. More importantly, public opinion was strongly against the marriage. The idea of an American divorcee as queen consort was unacceptable to most British people. Edward faced a choice: give up Wallis Simpson or give up the throne. He chose Wallis. On December 11, 1936, Edward abdicated, and Albert became King George VI. Elizabeth, the girl born at Glamis Castle, was now Queen of the United Kingdom and Empress of India. She was 46 years old and had never expected or wanted to be queen. But duty called, and she answered. As queen, Elizabeth became one of the most beloved figures in British history. During the Second World War, when London was bombed by the German Luftwaffe night after night, she refused to evacuate to Canada, where she and her daughters would be safe. "The children won't leave without me. I won't leave without the king, and the king will never leave," she famously declared. This stubborn courage endeared her to the British people, who were themselves enduring the Blitz with stoic determination. When Buckingham Palace was bombed in September 1940, she said, "I'm glad we've been bombed. Now I can look the East End in the face. The East End of London, where working-class Londoners lived, had been heavily bombed, and there was some resentment that the royal family seemed safe in their palace while ordinary people suffered. The bombing of Buckingham Palace demonstrated that the royal family was sharing the danger, and the Queen's comment showed her awareness of the psychological importance of shared sacrifice. This combination of aristocratic dignity and common humanity endeared her to the British people. She visited bombed areas, speaking with people who had lost their homes and loved ones. She toured factories where women were working to produce munitions and aircraft. She sent her daughters to talk with evacuee children. She made radio broadcasts encouraging the nation to keep fighting. In an age of total war, when civilian morale was as important as military strength, Queen Elizabeth played a crucial role in maintaining British determination to resist Nazi Germany. King George VI died in 1952, and his daughter became Queen Elizabeth II. The former Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon became Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother, a title created specifically for her. She lived to the extraordinary age of 101, dying on March 30, 2002. Throughout her long life, she retained a special affection for Glamis Castle, the place where she was born and where she had learned the values that would sustain her through decades of public service. She visited regularly, attended family events there, and took pride in the castle's recognition as one of Scotland's most important historic buildings. Her funeral in Westminster Abbey was attended by royalty from around the world and was watched on television by millions. The British public mourned genuinely. She had been a constant presence for over a century, embodying continuity, duty, and grace under pressure. And Glamis Castle, which had produced this remarkable woman, gained additional luster from her achievements. Since 1987, an illustration of Glamis Castle has appeared on the reverse side of £10 notes issued by the Royal Bank of Scotland. This is a remarkable honour, reflecting the castle's status as one of Scotland's most iconic buildings. Along with Edinburgh Castle, Stirling Castle, and a handful of other landmarks, Glamis represents Scotland to the world. Millions of people who have never visited Scotland or even Britain have seen Glamis Castle on Scottish banknotes, recognising its distinctive silhouette even if they don't know its name or history. The castle is currently the home of Simon Bowes-Lyon, 19th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn, who succeeded to the earldom in 2016. But unlike earlier eras when the castle was purely a private residence, inaccessible to anyone outside the family and their invited guests, Glamis is now open to the public for much of the year. Visitors can tour the principal rooms, walk through the gardens, visit the small chapel where the White Lady's seat remains reserved, and explore the grounds. This opening to the public serves multiple purposes. It generates income to help with the enormous costs of maintaining a building of this size and age. It also fulfills a kind of educational and cultural mission, allowing people to experience historic architecture and learn about Scottish history in a direct, tangible way. The castle is protected as a Category A listed building, the highest level of protection under Scottish law, reserved for buildings of national or international importance. This designation means that any changes to the building, even relatively minor ones, require approval from Historic Environment Scotland. The goal is to preserve the building's historic character while allowing necessary maintenance and adaptation to modern needs. The grounds are included in the Inventory of Gardens and Designed Landscapes in Scotland, the national listing of significant gardens. This means that both the castle and its surrounding landscape are recognised as irreplaceable parts of Scotland's cultural heritage. The estate surrounding Glamis covers more than 57 square kilometres, over 14,000 acres of farmland, forest, gardens, and parkland. This is still a working estate, producing timber, beef, and other agricultural products. The farms and forests of Glamis employ dozens of people and contribute to the local economy of Angus. The two streams running through the estate, including Glamis Burn, which flows past the arboretum, support diverse wildlife, including salmon, trout, otters, and water voles. The Arboretum itself has become a destination for botanists and nature lovers. Trees from every continent grow here. Giant sequoias from California reaching heights of over 50 meters, cedars of Lebanon with their characteristic horizontal branching spreading wide, monkey puzzle trees from Chile with their distinctive armored appearance, exotic maples from Japan that turn brilliant colors in autumn, and rare conifers from remote regions of Asia. Some specimens are several hundred years old, planted by 18th or 19th century earls who were passionate about horticulture and had access through the British Empire to plants from around the world. Walking through the Arboretum is a journey through botanical history. Each tree represents an era of exploration and the expansion of human knowledge about the natural world. The giant sequoias were discovered by European botanists in California in the 1850s and caused a sensation. Trees that could live for thousands of years and grow to heights that dwarfed any European tree. The monkey puzzle tree, with its prehistoric appearance and bizarre armored trunk and branches, was brought back from Chile by Scottish botanist Archibald Menzies in 1795. The Japanese maples represent the opening of Japan to Western trade in the 1850s after centuries of isolation. In 2010, a rose was named Glamis Castle by the English rose grower David Austin, one of the world's most famous breeders of roses. The Glamis Castle rose is a white English rose with a strong classic myrrh fragrance that fills gardens on warm summer evenings. It blooms repeatedly through the summer, producing wave after wave of flowers. It is known for its beautiful cup-shaped flowers that open from pointed buds into perfect rosettes. The choice of name was a tribute to the castle's beauty and its romantic associations. Like the castle itself, the Glamis Castle rose combines elegance with strength, delicate beauty with robust health that allows it to flourish in various climates. The castle's archives, housed in the clock tower, contain a wealth of historical material relating to the Bowes and Lyon families. These include a papal bull, a formal document issued by the Pope, with the lead seal that gives these documents their name, and the memoirs of Mary Eleanor Bowes, the Cole heiress who married into the Lyon family in 1767. Her memoirs provide a fascinating glimpse into 18th century aristocratic life, describing everything from daily routines to the elaborate social rituals of the period. The Glamis archives have a close connection with the archives at the University of Dundee, and researchers who wish to consult material held in the Glamis Castle archive do so in the search room at the university. This arrangement ensures that scholars can access these important historical documents while preserving them under proper archival conditions with controlled temperature and humidity. The castle's small chapel, with seating for only 46 people, continues to be used for family functions. Baptisms, confirmations, weddings, and memorial services for family members are still held here, maintaining a tradition that stretches back centuries. And according to the guides who lead tours through the castle, no one is ever allowed to sit in the White Lady's seat. Whether you believe in ghosts or simply respect tradition, that empty seat serves as a reminder of Janet Douglas, Lady Glamis, who was burned at the stake in 1537, protesting her innocence to the end. Glamis Castle's influence extends far beyond Scotland and far beyond the world of history and architecture. In the British children's television series Thomas and Friends, Lord Callan's castle is based on Glamis Castle, introducing millions of children worldwide to its distinctive silhouette of towers and turrets. Young viewers see an animated version of the castle and unconsciously absorb its romantic, fairy tale appearance into their imagination of what castles should look like. In 1982, Belgian comic artist Roger Leloup featured a near-identical version of Glamis as Loch Castle on the cover of his Yoko Tsuno album La Proie et l'Ombre, The Prey and the Shadow. The science fiction adventure, featuring time travel and supernatural mysteries, used Glamis's distinctive architecture to create an atmosphere of ancient mystery. Even Star Trek The Next Generation mentioned Glamis Castle in the Season 7 episode Sub Rosa, when the planet's governor references the castle in discussing her colony's Scottish heritage. These popular culture references reflect Glamis's status as an architectural icon. The castle's distinctive appearance, its vertical emphasis, conical turrets, and fairy tale silhouette, makes it instantly recognizable. Unlike the massive fortresses of England with their thick walls and military austerity, or the ornate Renaissance palaces of continental Europe with their classical symmetry and horizontal emphasis, Glamis represents a uniquely Scottish architectural tradition that combines medieval strength with Renaissance elegance and a touch of the fantastical. Shakespeare's Macbeth remains Glamis's most significant cultural legacy. Although the historical Macbeth never lived at Glamis, Shakespeare's play has linked the castle's name with one of literature's greatest tragedies for over 4 centuries. Every year, hundreds of thousands of students around the world study Macbeth and encounter the name Glamis in the opening scenes. The phrase, "Glamis thou art and Cawdor," has become one of the most quoted lines in English literature, instantly recognizable to educated people everywhere. The play's association with Glamis has been both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it has made the castle famous far beyond what its historical importance alone would warrant. On the other hand, it has created confusion about the castle's actual history and contributed to its reputation for dark mysteries and supernatural occurrences. The witches, murders, and madness of Shakespeare's play color how people perceive the real castle, even though the historical connection is tenuous at best. The legends of the monster of Glamis, the White Lady, and Earl Beardy have also entered popular consciousness through countless retellings. Books about haunted castles, television programs about the paranormal, and articles about Britain's ghostly heritage have featured Glamis prominently. These stories may not be literally true, but they speak to something deeper: the human need for mystery, for the possibility that our rational, scientifically explained world still contains corners where the supernatural might exist. In an age of smartphones and satellite navigation, when no place on Earth remains unmapped and mysterious, haunted castles like Glamis preserve a sense of wonder and uncertainty. They remind us that history is not just facts and dates, but stories and emotions, and that some questions may never be fully answered. Whether or not the monster of Glamis existed, the legend serves a purpose. It makes us think about how we treat people who are different, about the secrets families keep, and about the gap between public respectability and private reality. Glamis Castle has stood for over 6 centuries. It has witnessed the murder of a Scottish king in 1034, the burning of a noblewoman accused of witchcraft in 1537, civil wars and foreign occupations in the 17th century, fires and restorations in the 19th century, and the birth of a queen mother and a princess in the 20th century. Its stones have absorbed the joys and sorrows of dozens of generations of the Lion family. Its rooms have hosted kings and queens, presidents and prime ministers, artists and writers, soldiers recovering from war, and children playing in safety. What makes Glamis extraordinary is not just its age or its beauty, though both are remarkable. What makes Glamis extraordinary is its continuity. In an age of constant change, when families scatter across continents and ancestral homes are sold to pay taxes or converted into hotels and conference centres, Glamis remains in the hands of the family that has owned it since 1372. Simon Bowes Lyon, 19th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn, is the direct descendant of Sir John Lyon, who received Glamis as a gift from King Robert II over 650 years ago. This unbroken chain of inheritance, maintained through plague and war, political upheaval and economic change, is almost miraculous in its improbability. This continuity matters. It creates a living link to the past that no museum or historical site can replicate. When visitors tour Glamis Castle, they are not walking through a preserved relic, frozen in time like a medieval theme park. They are walking through a home that is still lived in, still loved, still part of a family's daily life. The same staircases that Lady Elizabeth Bowes Lyon climbed as a child are climbed by her descendants today. The same chapel where generations of Lyons were baptized and married still hosts family services. The same grounds that the 9th Earl landscaped in the picturesque style of the 1770s still provide pleasure to the current Earl and his family. This living continuity makes history tangible in a way that academic study alone cannot achieve. In an interview, a family member once reflected on what it means to be custodian of such a place. "You don't really own it," they said. "You're just keeping it safe for the next generation." This attitude, this sense of stewardship rather than ownership, is what has allowed Glamis to survive when so many other great estates have been lost. Each generation of the family has understood that they are merely temporary guardians of something larger than themselves. They inherited the castle from their parents and will pass it on to their children, hopefully improved and certainly preserved. This sense of stewardship extends beyond the building itself to the land, the tenants, the employees, and even the stories and traditions. Maintaining an estate like Glamis is enormously expensive. Property taxes, maintenance costs, heating bills, staff salaries, all these add up to a burden that would bankrupt most people. The family meets these costs through a combination of agricultural income from the estate, entrance fees from tourists, and careful financial management. They make compromises, opening the house to tourists during the summer months, even though it means a loss of privacy. They operate the estate as a business while trying to maintain it as a home. The legends of Glamis, the monster, the White Lady, Earl Beardy playing cards with the devil, serve a similar purpose of maintaining continuity. They remind us that history is not just dates and facts, but stories and emotions. Whether or not you believe in ghosts, the legend of the White Lady keeps alive the memory of Janet Douglas, an innocent woman murdered by a vengeful king. Whether or not you believe in the monster of Glamis, the legend reminds us of a time when people with disabilities or deformities were hidden away in shame rather than embraced with compassion and given the care and support they needed. Perhaps this is Glamis Castle's greatest legacy. It reminds us that buildings are more than stone and mortar, more than architecture and decoration. They are repositories of memory, vessels of identity, and links between past and future. Every castle, every great house, every historic building is a kind of time machine. When we walk through their doors, we step into the past and can, if we pay attention, hear the echoes of all who came before. We can imagine Malcolm II dying in the hunting lodge that preceded the castle. We can picture Patrick Lyon directing workmen as they transform a medieval fortress into a Renaissance palace. We can hear the screams of Janet Douglas as flames consumed her. We can see Lady Elizabeth organizing the rescue of treasures as fire threatened to destroy her childhood home. We can feel the presence of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, who carried the values learned at Glamis throughout her long life of public service. Glamis Castle stands today as it has for over 6 centuries, its towers rising from the fertile plains of Strathmore, its stones bearing witness to Scottish history from medieval times to the present day. It has survived wars and fires, occupation and transformation, financial pressures and changing social structures. It has produced a Queen Mother beloved by millions and become an icon recognized around the world. And it continues, generation after generation, to be what it has always been, the home of the Lyon family, a masterpiece of Scottish architecture and a living reminder that the past is never truly past. It lives on in the places we preserve, the stories we continue to tell, and the values we pass down from one generation to the next. In the end, Glamis Castle represents hope. Hope that beauty and history can survive in a world that often seems to value only the new and the efficient. Hope that families can maintain their connection across generations despite the centrifugal forces of modern life. Hope that we can be good stewards of what we inherit, preserving it for those who will come after us. And hope that the stories we tell, about ghosts and monsters, about queens and commoners, about triumph and tragedy, will continue to resonate with people who need to believe that there is more to life than what we can see and measure, that mystery and wonder still have a place in our rational scientific world. Glamis Castle is not perfect. It represents a social system, aristocracy, that most modern people would not want to live under. It was built and maintained by wealth, generated partly through coal mining, an industry that exploited workers and contributed to climate change. Its legends reflect prejudices and fears that we have hopefully outgrown. But it also represents human striving for beauty, for permanence, for connection to the past. It shows what human hands can create and what human determination can preserve, and that is worth celebrating, worth visiting, and worth protecting for the generations yet to come.